I've been a chemistry professor for nearly 20 years, and I pride myself on running a tight ship, safety goggles on at all times, no loose clothing, no food or drink in the lab. These rules are sacrosanct, and I enforce them with a precision that borders on obsession. But none of that mattered to Todd Watkins. Todd wasn't the kind of student who cared about rules. He was the type who strolled into the lab 10 minutes late, reeking of cologne, with that cocky, insufferable grin plastered across his face. His father was some big-shot donor to the university, and Todd wore his privilege like a badge of honor. I should have known better than to let him into my lab. It happened on a miserable November afternoon, the kind where the sky is so dark you'd think it was evening. I was overseeing a practical exam when Todd, predictably, decided the safety protocols didn't apply to him. He was texting on his phone, something I'd explicitly banned, when his elbow clipped a beaker of sulfuric acid. The acid splashed across the lab bench, hissing and bubbling as it ate into the surface. The stench was unbearable, sharp and acrid. My heart leapt into my throat as I shouted for everyone to step back. Todd just laughed. "Relax, Prof," he said, brushing it off like it was nothing. "It's not like anyone died." The rage that boiled up in me was immediate, primal. I wanted to scream at him, to humiliate him in front of the entire class. But I didn't. I couldn't. Students like Todd were untouchable. If I so much as raised my voice, he'd run crying to the dean and I'd be the one facing consequences. But that laugh, that smug, infuriating laugh, stayed with me. It replayed in my mind over and over that night as I sat alone in my lab, the rain hammering against the windows. That was when the idea came to me. If the university wouldn't punish Todd, then I would. It started innocently enough. I buried myself in research, scouring old texts and obscure papers for something, anything that might help me prove a point. But the more I read, the darker the material became. I stumbled across an old alchemical treatise titled De Mutationibus Corporis Humani. It described an ancient, forbidden process for altering human flesh. The warnings were clear. Do not attempt this. The cost is too great. But I didn't care. Night after night, I stayed late in the lab, synthesizing compounds and testing formulas. My colleagues thought I was preparing for a grant proposal, but the truth was far more sinister. I wasn't trying to help humanity. I was creating something to destroy it. Finally, after weeks of work, I had it. A serum. It was a viscous, amber-colored liquid that shimmered faintly in the light, almost alive. I called it Mutagenous X. I didn't know exactly what it would do, but I knew enough. It would transform Todd. The opportunity came on a Friday evening. Todd had left his lab coat behind, and I used it as an excuse to call him back to the lab. When he arrived, he was as smug as ever. "Hey, Prof," he said, sauntering in like he owned the place. "You've got my coat?" "It's right there," I said, pointing to a chair by the bench. "You must be thirsty after your day. Help yourself to some water." I slid the beaker toward him, my heart pounding. The serum was diluted, just enough to pass as water. Todd didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the beaker and downed it in one gulp. That's when it began. At first, he just looked confused. He touched his throat and frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his voice raspy. Then he started coughing, violently. His hands flew to his stomach as he doubled over, his body convulsing. I stepped back, watching with a mixture of horror and fascination. His skin was the first thing to change. It rippled, then split, as scales erupted across his arms and neck. His fingers elongated, the nails curving into black, jagged talons. He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror, but they weren't human anymore. They were bulbous, insect-like, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Help me," he choked, his voice distorted. I didn't move. His jaw unhinged with a sickening crack, his teeth sharpening into needle-like points. He let out a guttural scream that turned into an unearthly roar. Within minutes, Todd Watkins was gone. In his place was a monster, something that defied logic, biology, and everything I thought I knew about chemistry. The creature collapsed onto the floor, twitching. Its breathing was shallow, labored. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at what I had created. I knew I couldn't let anyone find out. Dragging the creature to the university's basement incinerator was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. It twitched weakly as I fed it into the flames, but I didn't stop. By morning, there was nothing left. When I walked into my classroom later that day, no one suspected a thing. I delivered my lecture as usual, my tone as dry and unremarkable as ever. But deep down, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: power. A week later, the rumors started. Students claimed they'd seen a shadowy figure lurking near the chemistry building, a creature with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. At first, I dismissed it as nonsense. But late at night, when I was alone in the lab, I began to hear things: scratching sounds in the vents, faint growls that seemed to come from nowhere. And then one night I saw it, and I was packing up ready to leave when I heard a loud crash. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly I turned toward the vent above my desk. 2 glowing eyes stared back at me. "Todd!" I whispered, my voice trembling. The vent burst open with a deafening clang, and the last thing I saw was a set of needle-like fangs lunging for my throat. They never found my body, just a shattered beaker on the lab floor, its contents shimmering faintly in the light. Some say the chemistry building is cursed, that late at night you can hear claws scraping against the walls. But if you ask the students at Merriweather University, they'll tell you one thing for sure: never, ever trust your professor's water.